In the early spring of 1915, the British began to mount the Dardanelles operation to relieve their Russian allies and to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Their object was to capture Constantinople and the Straits. But Constantinople and the Straits constituted a prize coveted for more than a century by their new allies, the Russians. As the Dardanelles campaign opened, the Russians made it clear to the Western allies that when the war was over, these waters and the great city which stood on them were to be Russian. The Tsar sought from his allies what, as former enemies, they had long denied him. So what card did he play? This one. On the Eastern Front, the Russians engaged large and powerful German armies. If these armies were to turn to the west, this would be a disaster for the French and British. There were very strong hints from the Russian leadership that a separate peace would be made if their demands were not met. Stretched on the rack of the Western Front, soon in difficulty in the Dardanelles, the British and French reluctantly gave in to the Russian demands. Round one of the diplomatic game to the Russians. A revolution in the balance of power which triggered off round two. This began as the British and French turned on each other in a diplomatic struggle for what remained of the Ottoman Empire. The French opened the game by asking for a great deal, for the whole of the Levant, beginning on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey itself and running down to what is now the Gaza Strip in southern Palestine. The French wanted all this coastline and a substantial part of the hinterland of that coast, including Palestine. This was not acceptable to the British. The British certainly didn't want the French sitting on the Egyptian border. Egypt was then British, threatening the canal, Britain's gateway to her Indian Empire. After a good deal of give and take, the agreement the French and British finally came to, which was signed in May 1916, produced a map which looked like this. The area which is now called Syria and the Lebanon was to be in the French sphere of influence. The area which is now Jordan, southern Palestine, and a good deal more besides, was to be in the British sphere of influence. Most of the area which was later Palestine was called in the agreement the Brown area. The Brown area was not to be under the control of any particular power. It was to be internationally administered for the ostensibly high-minded reason that the holy places were there. The Brown area, roughly Palestine, would be run, among others, by the British, French and the Russians, who were a party to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it was called, after the names of the principal negotiators. Looked at in terms of British interests, the Sykes-Picot Agreement had succeeded in pushing back strong French claims very substantially. The French were no longer in a position to threaten Egypt. So round two to the British. In 1916, instigated by the British, the Bedouin tribesmen of the Hejaz, in what is now Saudi Arabia, had risen against their Turkish masters, the Arab Revolt. The story of the Arab Revolt is now part of the mythology as well as the history of the period. Its military function was modest. As far as the British were concerned, its main purpose was political, to undermine the loyalty of the Arab provinces and of the numerous Arab soldiers who served the Turks. But the Arab Revolt had another purpose. It enabled the British to persuade the French to modify and soften their original extensive demands. In crude terms, the British were able to argue that they were taking territory from the French to reward the Arabs rather than to advantage themselves. But were the Arabs who were encouraged by the British to rise themselves deceived and misled? This is the heart of what became known as the Arab question. Certainly the Arabs were exposed to some grandiose rhetoric about restoring a great Arab nation, to hints about establishing an Arab caliphate to replace the Turks as leaders of the Muslim world. Many Arabs believed that the British also promised that Palestine would be part of an Arab state. But in their dealing with this man, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein, leader of the revolt, the British were fulsome. But here again they were also deliberately vague and non-committal. MacMahon, the principal British negotiator, was high-flown but evasive. The correspondence he engaged in with the Sharif peters out inconclusively. It contains nothing concrete. It can't be construed as a binding treaty. But whatever the letters actually did or did not promise, the tune they played was one which would later sound faithless to Arab ears.
I
believe that, but for the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Arab territories would have been one unified country with an integrated economy. What Syria lacks, we can find in the Arabian Peninsula. What the peninsula lacks, we can find in Iraq. What Iraq lacks can be found in Egypt, or in the Maghreb, or in Sudan. The Arab countries would have been economically integrated. And had it not been for these divisions, I believe the situation of the Arab states, or of the Arab people as a whole in the Middle East, would have been much better than it is now.